Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Amanda Hoover. I'm a reporter with NJ.com and the Star Ledger and a contributing reporter to NJ Cannabis Insider, a weekly trade journal that covers the cannabis industry in New Jersey. Today, we're going to be talking about the November 3rd ballot question, which seeks to amend the state constitution and legalize marijuana in New Jersey for those over the age of 21. Governor Phil Murphy began campaigning in 2017 on the promise of legalizing marijuana, and the state legislature has tried several times since he took office to pass a bill that would establish a legal marijuana industry in the state. But those bills have fallen short of the necessary votes several times, and lawmakers voted last year to put the question on the ballot and pose it to the people this fall. But 2020 came, and the coronavirus crisis has upended traditional campaigning, pushed the state to have a nearly all vote-by-mail election. 11 states and Washington, D.C. currently have legalized marijuana, and more than 30 states, including New Jersey, have a medical marijuana program in place. If voters say yes to the ballot question, New Jersey will become the 12th state in the country to legalize marijuana for adult use and the first in our region. Those in favor of legalization say it will create jobs and tax revenue and decrease the number of people arrested in New Jersey for marijuana possession, a disproportionate number of whom are Black. But those who oppose legalization say creating ways to purchase marijuana could result in more incidents of driving under the influence or have other risks for public safety. Joining me today in this discussion is Tara Sargente, the executive director of NJ Cannabis Association and founder of the edibles company Blazin' Bakery, Jessica Gonzalez, an attorney with Bressler Amery Ross, and outside general counsel for Minorities for Medical Marijuana, and Bishop Jethro James, a pastor at Paradise Baptist Church in Newark and a senior advisor to NJ R.A.M.P, responsible purchase to marijuana policy, and a spokesperson joining us today to represent Don't Let NJ Go to Pot. Thank you all so much for being here today and being part of this discussion. Just to start this off, saying how the governor and legislature have been calling for this for years. We've seen several bills fail. Last November, it was moved to the ballot. That wasn't an ideal outcome for those in favor or those opposed. So let's just start off by, Tara, can you start off by telling us how this movement to the ballot question has kind of affected the debate and everything about legalization?
Absolutely. So this momentum started back in 2018 when Governor Murphy took office and pledged to legalize cannabis within the first 100 days. After that, we've seen a lot of obstacles. We've seen a lot of opposition, largely from the Republican side, although that has changed over the past 2 years, where we're now seeing majority support. So the legislation that was crafted had gotten onto the floor. It passed the initial hurdles to get through. And then at the last minute, we lost it of November of last year by 2 votes. So really, it took a lot of the power away from the flexibility we would have moving forward. But the exciting part is it put the power in the hands of the people of New Jersey, which is why we are rallying now to take some initiatives to really educate people, because A, there's not a lot of knowledge that this is on the ballot for some people, and B, they're unclear about how the multitude of ways of how this is going to help the state of New Jersey.
And Bishop James, from the other side, I know there were people in opposition to this who said, if the legislature can't get it done, now why move to the ballot? What is the take, and where do you come at in this conversation now that it's a ballot question, not just a bill?
Well, first and foremost, my learned colleague, Tara, it was the Democratic side, one of my parishioners and myself, Senator Ronald Rice, Democrat, that led the fight in the legislature against legalization of marijuana. One of the reasons it would devastate New Jersey in several ways, dealing with mental health. And then if we look at New Jersey, let's talk about the laws that will be impacted and prohibit people who think they have legal rights to marijuana. Just one. For example, every baby born in the state of New Jersey, the mother's blood is tested for substance, any federal controlled substance. Even if the state passes this on referendum and it becomes part of the Constitution, DCP&P or the old DIFAS, you will have a case of if your blood tests, because it's a federal banned substance, positive, and this goes across all social, economic, and ethnic lines, you will now have a child welfare case open on you. There is no way around it, which means you can't work, for any school system. You can't be around children, and your employer has to be notified. That's a fact. No one is talking about that except for those of us that are in the back room with the legislators. That's just one of the many reasons it didn't pass. The other thing is, and I share this with you, I talked to several former attorney generals, and I'm an advisor to the one now. There are several problems that we see with legalization, looking at what has happened in other states. And the reality is that if you legalize marijuana, if you think you have a lot of problems now in our community, it will devastate the African-American community, devastate it. And I could go on with the employment piece. I could go on with the mental health piece. I could go on that the fact is, in those states that have already legalized marijuana, the reality is that the black market is booming. And just recently on CNN, they had a big piece about California. There's so much illegal marijuana around that California now has warehouses of legal marijuana, and no one is making the money. If you look,
excuse me, were we just supposed to talk about the road thus far, or are we supposed to bring up all your talking points? Because if so, there's much more I could have said.
Bishop James, I want to give
right,
give Jessica a bit of a chance to respond to some of that, because she, works in cannabis law, and some of those issues that were raised. Jessica, do you have any response to some of those questions that are some of the uncertainties around what this might bring for the state?
Yeah, sure. So I actually would like to touch upon two things that the bishop brought up. One was about pregnant women. However, actually in our medical law, if you are a medical patient, no action can actually be taken against the mother on the basis that she is a medical cannabis patient. So that protection already exists. The same type of protection also exists for employees as well who are medical cannabis patients. And the fact that they cannot be discriminated, they cannot be fired solely on the basis that they are medical cannabis patients. So I would just like to make 2 points very clear, that our laws already protect both of those types of classes of people that the bishop has brought up. And I would imagine that the bill for adult use cannabis would reflect the same type of protections.
May I respond to that? We're not talking about medical marijuana here. Let's frame the issue. We're not talking about medical cannabis. We have no problem with medical cannabis. If you want to talk about adult use, then let's talk about decriminalization. But it does not protect any woman unless she is medically. And so let's frame the issue.
Oh,
we're not talking about medical. We're not talking about medical here. We're talking about we're not talking about medical. And yes, the fact is that yes, you will, if you, Jessica, with all due respect, have a child and you don't have a prescription for medical marijuana, you will have an adult child case open on you. That's a fact.
And I think that is something very unfortunate that you bring up. And I think that's why we have to jump through the unnecessary hurdles. But I'm glad the option is there for all women to be able to become a medical marijuana patient because of those injustices that are still in place. And I've said many times, after November 3rd, our battle is not over. Everything you bring up is still things advocates like myself and Jessica and my organization will all continue to fight for, such as there's no hospital code for if someone comes in, they are labeled a substance abuser. They're not labeled that way if they had a glass of wine the night before. These are horrible injustices and they do need to be fixed. And you're bringing up just the reasons why we need to take this first important step of legalization so we could start fixing the minutia of all the other injustices. And on a much earlier point, Senator Ron Rice has never been an ally. He's always, been a bit behind the times on all of this, all due respect. And I was talking more about our allies, our wonderful allies in both the Democratic and Republican Party, some of who were swing votes that we cannot swing at the last moment.
I want to bring this back to the question and the different organizations. One of the largest ones, a coalition that is in favor of legalization, NJCAN 2020. I know Tara and Jessica, both of your organizations have some involvement here. It's a very large coalition. Can you just give listeners a little bit of an overview of who's a part of this and some of the reasons that this coalition has formed and its basis argument for legalization?
Sure. So NJCAN is actually made up of a lot of advocates in the space who have really, really centered a lot of their work on legalization, but also social equity as well. So the coalition is made up of various advocacy groups, lawyers, doctors, business folks from every sort of type of industry that you can really think of who has really a stake in this. And the reason we want to legalize is it doesn't have to just do with the economic benefits that New Jersey desperately needs post this epidemic, but also there's a lot of the social justice concerns that have been going on. So what the bishop is really advocating for is to maintain the status quo, right? By the time that we are done with this talk in an hour, we'll have another 1 or 2 folks arrested, given that 96 people are arrested per day for cannabis-related arrests, the majority being Black and Latino. The decriminalization, as what the bishop brought up, is not enough. And we don't even have to think about this in theoreticals. We just have to look at our neighbors across the river in New York, where they decriminalized actually in the 70s. And yet in 2017, they arrested close to 17,000 people for low-level cannabis arrests. So much so that it was such a pervasive problem with the fact that 95% were people of color, that in 2019, they had to once again revamp their decriminalization laws because of the loopholes that were created. So decriminalization is just not enough. And we just seen it really just across the Hudson River, how it's not going to stop the arrest. It's not going to stop the police interactions, because it still allows for police to be able to search you based on smell or based on sight. And so what we are really advocating for here is both for New Jersey to turn over a new leaf, really look back on its extremely, participation in the racial discrepancies when it comes to the criminalization of cannabis, but as well, it's going to create jobs, right? Right now, we are seeing that 40 million people in the United States have filed for unemployment. There are folks in New Jersey who I've spoken to who still have not been able to receive a lot of their unemployment benefits. Cannabis has created over 200,000 jobs, and it is the fastest growing market in the world, and it's not going to stop, and we will be left behind and continue to maintain with a very, very dangerous status quo that is going to be absent of those protections that the bishop is explicitly asking for.
Mm-hmm.
And Amanda, sorry,
I just wanted to
definitely,
if there were any viewers who maybe aren't aware of this, there are 2 bills seeking to decriminalize marijuana in New Jersey. Neither of those have passed the full legislature yet. So that's something that is still an issue and not something that we have here, although New York, Philadelphia, have passed laws that would do that. And so Tara, did you want to jump in off some of the points?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I definitely want to answer your question about NJCAN because they are doing some wonderful work, but I did want to add to Jess's bit about decriminalization. So a little anecdotal thing, if I were to apply for a cannabis license in New Jersey, the last round, the application fee was $18,000. So these are your people who would grow cannabis, make edibles or any kind of processing, and your dispensaries. If we were to decriminalize, the fine is $50 a day. You know what $50 a day is? It's around $18,000 a year. Okay, we spend $500,000 applying for an application. So just the application fee is what you would get in penalties if you got fined every single day under decrim. So you know what that does? It explodes the gray market. California had such a thriving gray market that they have still never recovered from it. Because if that's your biggest penalty, then everyone is going to put up a little lab in their kitchen and start selling and start dealing because there's no more fears. There's no more repercussions. So when you only support decriminalization, you encourage the black market 1,000,000 times over. And now, if we look at the problems that we've had in the cannabis industry, when things have things like the vape crisis, where people were being poisoned, that was coming from the illicit market. That was coming from a thriving black market, which New Jersey will flourish if we decriminalize. The only way to keep our children safe, to keep our people safe, to keep our patients safe is to have a fully taxed and regulated, inspected, across the board, regulated, legalized adult use market. Okay. So that's my thoughts on decrim. And just for NJCAN, check out their website. One of the best things that I think is doing, and it's never all about money, but just brought up the social equity. No.
Yes, it is.
I mean, I don't know who funds your organizations, probably Big Pharma.
No,
But so I
no,
will say that we spend
I'm sorry.
I was still talking. I was still talking,
Oh,
sir.
excuse me.
143 million is spent every year in New Jersey on cannabis arrests. That is money that we could take, and aside from we could take our police force away and put them onto violent crime. Now, the new revenue that could be generated is over 300 million. And that's an early conservative estimate. So this is something we could put into new roads, new schools, and most importantly at this time, to revitalize our devastated economy due to this pandemic. So check out NJ.CAN. It's there's really just a lot of good to come for our families, for the state of New Jersey.
Now, Bishop,
Amanda,
I want to
may I-
get to your organization, Don't Let NJ Go to Pot, kind of newly formed. I know there's been opposition from NJ R.A.M.P for longer than this, but can you talk a little bit about some of the ideas behind Don't Let NJ Go to Pot, and why this isn't being seen as, why legalization isn't being seen by your organization as a solution to some of these racial justice issues?
Well, first of all, it's racial injustice. Let's talk about folks like myself that had a corporate career. We know, let's talk about the employment piece first and foremost. We know that in the state of New Jersey, you will not work for New Jersey Transit and be a casual smoker of cannabis. That's real. Or an edible, it's a public safety issue. Let's talk about, you're not going to get on a plane or a train with someone that has smoked or consumed cannabis. Let's talk about, because they did mention some things that I really want to talk about. The decrim bill, let's talk about that. If you get a traffic ticket and don't pay the ticket, the price goes up. We know that. That's why so many people, poor people of color, because they started talking about social justice. Let's talk about the social injustice. The social injustice, number one, and they're not talking about this. If you get federal assistance for food stamps, marijuana is a federal banned substance, and you are turned in, you will lose, and the attorneys will tell you this, you will lose your food stamps. Let's talk about if you live in public housing and you're getting TRA, temporary rental assistance, you will lose your temporary rental assistance because they are federal programs. They talked about employment. Let's talk about employment, and let's talk about social justice. In places like Denver, they have more pot shops in the African American and Latino community than they have McDonald's and Burger King's put together. Those are facts. Let's talk about employment. Your employment is done if you have a CDL. Your employment is done if you work in a school system. If you work for where I retired from, PSENG, you will not be employed. There is no bill and no talk of a bill. Then let's talk about African Americans as part in the national cannabis industry. Less than 1% of African Americans own anything. And that's part of this is about money. Let's tell the truth. Even we already have 47 municipalities, including the one for Governor Murphy, that has already opted out if this should go through. I've sat at the table with some of the folks from the cannabis industry, talking to some of the government people that would have to regulate this, and they have no idea. They're not talking about states where they're seeing in the African American community 70% increase in juvenile arrest. In Montclair State University right now, there's a program in the city of Patterson dealing with children as young as 11 years old that smoke cannabis every day. There is no police force in the world that can keep it out of the hands of youth. All the money for code enforcement would be forced upon the local municipality. And as we know, even before COVID hit, most of your urban centers are under some type of state regulation when it comes to spending. They talked about police doing some other things. Well, I'm very proud to be a state police chaplain. Over 20 years, I actually worked the triage 9/11 And so we have talked about this from former attorney generals, and I don't want to put anybody in the current administration on blast, but there's some real concerns about legalization. Number one, if you smell cannabis in a car at a routine traffic stop, you are obligated to investigate because they may be driving under the influence. As you know, and someone mentioned about a glass of wine. That's why you have MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And we could go on and on and on. They talked about programs that were going to give back to communities of color that have been devastated by drugs. The state of New Jersey does not allow a set aside. And we all know that 25 years ago, and I guess I'm older than everybody else on, 25 years ago, Atlantic City was the answer to our crisis for funds for education. Well, it hasn't happened, and it never will. This is about greed. This is about a few rich people getting richer, and they don't look like me. This is about people that are on the backs of poor people and will always. And this is about drugs, mental health, and more devastation in communities of color.
James,
So imagine
I want to
getting
get to some of our questions that come from some readers who submitted in ahead of this. So I have one from Jim Langenbeck of Bridgewater, and I think it kind of relates to the conversation we've just been having, but he was wondering, how do we see legalization affecting the black market distribution networks? So a lot of people think that, just decriminalizing the black market will continue to flourish, but by legalizing, we could stamp out some of this. So Jessica, do you want to hop in on that?
Yeah, sure. So for anybody who's advocating either for anti-legalization or for decriminalization, essentially what you're advocating for is maintaining the status quo. So if you are upset about the illicit market, what I call the legacy market, then legalization is really the only solution that can be applied to it's never going to be eliminated. That's for one thing. Anybody who thinks that is just completely delusional. But regardless, there is a way to be able to take a market that is already flourishing. Cannabis has been around for over 5,000 years. It's not going anywhere. So instead, what we're doing is we're allowing the legacy market to flourish, allowing for a lot of the proximity from cannabis to more illicit drugs to be available to teenagers, to be available to kids. What we want to do with legalization is cut that proximity off. If anybody has ever been to a dispensary, you would know that there are layers on layers on layers of security. This is not something that you can go into a regular liquor store and buy something, or the way a child could just go in and buy some Advil or buy some Tylenol. This actually encourages folks to really be safe about it, because you have to go into a dispensary. There is typically a wall and a security guard there. You provide them your ID. It is tracked how much cannabis you buy per day. And depending on which state you're in, there are caps on how much that you can purchase within a day and within a month. But that information is then given back to the state. You then go into another room, which then leads you into another room. And those are the security protocols. And that is essentially what's going to cut the proximity from the legacy market, who is able to right now provide, not just cannabis, but cocaine and harder drugs. You will not find that in a dispensary. And I guarantee you that absolutely nobody who has a license, as Tara said, spending over $500,000 for a license, is going to implicate that license to be able to sell to a 13-year-old.
Absolutely. And I do believe, and maybe this is a bit wide-eyed and optimistic, I think over a long enough timeline, we will see the illicit market go away, because no one is buying bathtub gin anymore. There's no one taking alcohol across state lines. The smugglers are gone. It just will take time to create a completely fully regulated market, but it happened with alcohol, happened here. Now, one thing I want listeners to really pay attention to is some manipulative language. You've heard the word pot shops. That's kind of like calling a bar like a hooch house or a booze barn. Like, it's just ridiculous. They're adult use dispensaries, and how we've talked about, using alcohol, use responsibly. We are regulating this for adults over the age of 21. We are not putting up, these brothels of cannabis use. It's absolutely ridiculous. If you've been in one, they look like the Apple store, and the fact that many of them open up in minority or, communities that have, are in lower income, socioeconomic status is a boon to them because that's revenue coming into the municipality. So part of the actually advantages were given to some people who want to open small businesses. And, saying you've been at the table with legislators. Well, I am the single largest civilian contributor to the Jay Koenig medical marijuana bill, which was the first passed in a decade, passed last year, that has done worlds for patient rights. And one of the things we included to either be implemented there or in the adult use bill is the micro license, which I personally wrote. And it is the only social equity piece to be in any cannabis legislation in the state of New Jersey. And that's the first legislation we passed in a decade. So, maybe it's not enough yet, but that is something we are fighting for. And we want to be the state that does it right. And everything I've done since the day I stepped out, really kind of took the stage 2 years ago fighting in New Jersey is to help women and minorities. And that is a priority, I think, across the board. It's something NJCAN's doing. I know it's something Jess works for as well. So really, this is it is about social equity, I think, at the one of the very most foundational levels.
May I respond to that? I believe the gentleman asked, would you please reinstate the question? Because I do want to answer his question.
Yeah, how do you see legalization affecting the black market distribution networks that currently exist?
First, in every state that we have seen, and since we're talking about Colorado, the black market is flourishing. In California, and this was just recent, you can look it up on CNN, they showed a piece where there's so much legal cannabis around because they cannot move it because of the black market. Those are facts. We've also seen in towns like Denver, former Mayor Webb, who I happen to know personally, has said that none of the money has benefited anybody. The money comes in our community, just like everything else, and goes out. And so there are no real African-American owners. And then you keep mixing. There's a difference, and again, I need to reiterate, there's a difference between what you're trying to do now and medical marijuana. Medical marijuana, we're not against. And I keep hearing about women and medical marijuana. Medical marijuana is just that. And there has been an abuse in the state of New Jersey, in Trenton, New Jersey. The beginning of this year, we had a doctor that wrote over 1.5 million prescriptions in 30 days. And of course, he was caught, and that's the way it should be. But you already have abuses in the medical marijuana market. They went and talked about money flowing into municipalities. The original bill talked about 1% the first year, 2%, and 3%. Of course, all of that's off the table now because it didn't happen. Some friends of mine, and I refuse to, but former attorney generals of this state have said this, and this is no disrespect intended, that if you're going to go into this business, you need $500,000 to $1 million to get in the business. Be in it for about 4 years, because after 4 years, you're probably the lawyers are going to make more money on the lawsuits for the mental health problems. The New England Journal of Medicine said if you're a regular cannabis smoker, your lungs will probably be gone before you're 35 and you will have your first heart attack. I didn't write that. The New England Journal of Medicine. We know, and so for you to say New Jersey's going to get it right, you're never going to stop. You're never going to stop the black market. One concern by law enforcement is that, let's say you pass this and you have, I'm going to just use the JJ brand, and my brand is 5 Fingers. There can be counterfeit packaging. This is a concern from the Attorney General's office. This is a concern. And now they're selling counterfeit packaging of marijuana. You talked about regulations. We know that in Colorado, they found out, and some of the largest companies out there were recently fined because the quality of the marijuana had gone bad. They washed it, rebagged it, resold it, and got caught. These are facts.
Before we get too far from talking about the medical program, because we did have a few people who wrote in questions for that, and I think there might be some patients who have some concerns or just some curiosities about what this might mean to them. And we in New Jersey have, even in the medical marijuana program, some of the most expensive medicine that people are paying at $300 to $500 an ounce. So we have a question from Sarah of Burlington, who wants to know if legalization will bring down the prices for medical marijuana. And I just, predictions. Tara, what's your take on that? Is that something that you think could happen with legalization and a growth, or is there going to be issues for patients as they're still trying to access medical marijuana and now there's these new adult use customers?
No, I mean, this is just very simple. Two things. Cannabis is a commodity. So as we have more supply and demand, it's going to be driven down. Also, we would live in a free market. So is there more competition as we have more dispensaries open? People are going to have to compete on price. Right now, because of the complete lack of patient access, we have people who sometimes have almost an hour drive because there's only 12 dispensaries in the state. That's going to change after adult use legalization, and we could, do dual use, however we end up breaking it down. So of course there'll be price competition, which will be amazing. Patients need not worry though, because we will make sure that patient demand is met before we sell adult use cannabis. So you'll never have to worry about your medicine being sold, just to someone casually using it. And as far as price goes as well, so many things the Reverend brings up as negatives, which something like we have been trying to protect someone who has public housing. One of the things we put is consumption lounges next to dispensaries, which they will be able to have a locker to keep their cannabis in should they want to use it as medicine. I know I don't want to keep talking about medical, but a lot of these injustices apply to patients, which is why we're still trying to fight them from either direction, just so we could protect people. But yeah, you're going to see just a lot of improvements across the board. And we'll so as these improvements come, something like insurance, when we start fighting on a local level, eventually it will go to a federal level, and insurance companies will be able to offer probably partial coverage, because at the end of the day, pharma will get involved and it is medicine, but we have to take the first steps. And the first steps are getting cannabis legalized in the state of New Jersey so we can move on to fighting the other battles.
Mm-hmm. And just in case viewers, aren't very familiar with the medical marijuana program in New Jersey, it's been around for going on a decade, and there's now 90,000 patients. It's kind of grown very exponentially in recent years, and there's still, very, very few dispensaries. Tara, you mentioned people are reporting long drives, and especially during the coronavirus crisis, people reported waiting in long lines. And there's this hold we're in on the licenses that could be growing the medical marijuana program.
And I would actually just like to kind of point one thing out with that. In a lot of states that have both medical and adult use, if you are a medical patient, you get preference when you walk into an adult use dispensary. You actually have your own line that you can go to. You take priority over those who are adult use who are not card holders. And then you're also exempt from the tax. So when this tax is phased out by 2024, medical patients will not actually have to pay that tax. And so with adult use comes a diversification of product that a lot of patients right now are complaining about. There's not enough competition. We have 12 operators here. That is not enough competition to incentivize any of them to diversify their products and lower their prices. But once you have more competition coming in, you're going to see diversification of product. You are going to see lower prices. And if you're a medical patient, you will be able to take priority in line, and you'll be exempt from the tax. So there are a lot of benefits for medical patients. And I just wanted to kind of put that out there. And I just do want to say just one thing to what the bishop said. The bishop said there are actually no real Black owners in cannabis. And I take great offense
Less
to that.
than 1%.
No, but you said there are no real ones.
I said less than 1%.
And I would like to say that I actually represent the first female, the African-American female in the country to own a license, and the youngest African-American. I represent two.
One.
So I do completely take offense, and I would say to please respect the owners.
I take offense that you would try to put out that there's more than one. You offend me by trying to act like that's going to help. That's like saying we fed one. There's millions of hungry people. But
I did not know Jessica represented them. That is Wanda James and Hope Wiseman. There's definitely at least two, because I knew just by her descriptor those two.
Two out of how many in the nation?
Oh, we need to improve. No doubt we need to
absolutely. And that's 100%
Thank you so much.
But not having legalization is not going to fix that. The only thing that is going to allow that is legalization, because right now, the tax revenue that is solely derived from the medical tax goes solely towards substance abuse disorder programs. That's it. There's no other flow of that tax revenue. With the tax revenue from adult use, that will be able to be used towards various different programs, one of which is a social equity program that I am really working hard to get through. However, without that funding, those programs aren't possible. And if those programs are not possible, then minority ownership is also not going to be possible in this space. So I just want to put that up.
And I just, going off the tax revenue, I want to get into this because when voters, turn over their ballot and look at this question, the tax rate is one of the few things that they will definitely get to see. It's a very brief question to establish what will be a complicated and intricate industry. And it puts the tax rate at the sales tax rate, 6.625%. That's a lot. That's much, much lower than many other states. And I know part of the idea in that is to not make the prices so high so that it's competitive with the black market. When we're talking about the ways that tax revenue could, come back and help some of the people who have been disadvantaged. Are there any concerns that rate is low? Do you guys think that that's going to be an amount of revenue that could be helpful? I know it will take a while for the industry to develop and for that to be seen, but just what are your thoughts on that, as it is one of the few kind of really concrete things we can see in that question?
Well, one of the things that we've seen in other states is that you're talking gross versus net. And what we've seen that the cost does not justify. And in the state of New Jersey, since we're talking about New Jersey, I want to stay in New Jersey. Under the original bill, they had asked for 14%. There was a big fight in the legislative committees about how much to tax this particular product if they were able to put it through. And there was a fight even between the governor and the Senate president on the amount. Once that got worked out, and of course the bill never went anywhere, thank God. The reality is that New Jersey is a home rule state. As I stated prior, money that was supposed to fix our education system was coming from the casinos in Atlantic City. Well, we don't have to tell you what happened to that. Every governor, if he or she needs money, they can pull from that pot and put it wherever. So the money never goes to the least of these. And that's the fact, that's the history. And so this is not about the same. Once again, I believe that they should do some things. You want to do something in the marijuana industry? Get a diversity of what they can do to lower the cost for the medical. Do what you can do for them to allow the medical places. We knew that when the governor, and I was at several meetings with inner city mayors, when they offered the new licenses for medical cannabis facilities, the price, access to capital is not real for the African American. It's not real. I talked to one of our former NBA players who said it cost them $5 million to get started in California. I don't doubt that. And so when you talk about social justice, it's not real. It's a way for some rich people. And I thank you, Tara, I really thank you, because the fact that two folks that look like me have a business in this country, it says there's something wrong. And in the state of New Jersey, by the way, Jessica, and I need to remind you of this. I know that you know this. New Jersey does not allow any set-asides. It's against the law. That's a fact.
I also agree with the bishop on something, and not only two people who look like you, two people who are female as well. And something that is a huge injustice is not just access to minority funding, but I've been very vocal about this recently. 98% of venture capital in cannabis goes to males. So it is very, very male dominated. So there's a lot of work to be done for funding for minorities, and there's a lot of work for women. But these are only things we can get to if we start actually legalizing it, because otherwise it's being ran away with by millionaires and billionaires. And the only way we get that is to start really implementing these and finding creative ways to get funding to these underprivileged communities, to these women with entrepreneurial ambitions and other people who want to get in the industry because they're getting shut out, because the only people who are getting the laws passed are the people with deep pockets. And it needs to be a grassroots movement as well, which is why I'm so excited for this ballot question and what we can do once it passes.
And I would also like to include, and so while set-asides, yes, are completely unconstitutional, and I completely agree with you, Bishop, that there needs to be more minority ownership in the cannabis space. However, we're, like as Tara said, we're not going to get there really without legalization, because as you can see, we haven't gotten there with medical. And so, however, in the medical bill, 15% of all cannabis licenses are to be awarded towards minority certified businesses, and 15% are supposed to be awarded to disabled veterans and women certified businesses. So there are actually those provisions in place already in the medical bill that actually came from 2703, which was the adult use bill. So that is already included and contemplated and will be built upon with legalization.
Let me share this with you. I did speak to the legal folks here in the state of New Jersey about those set-asides, and they've already said that they will be challenged in court. So women and minorities will not be able to get it because it still falls under the title of a set aside. The federal programs, and again, we're talking about full, I want to say commercialization versus medical. It's fine that medical folks should have the opportunity, but once you legalize cannabis for adult use, again, if you receive food stamps, you can lose them because that's a federal program, and we're only talking about state programs.
Bishop, I want to get back to
and housing
specific to the election, because I know we've been over some of the food stamp points earlier on in the program, but something that I do want to get into, this right now polls show this question looks poised to pass. It's about 2/3 up to 70% of voters polled so far have said that they are in favor. So if this does pass, pending some of the uncertainties of having an all mail-in election and how that could change some things, when will we actually start to see change? This question does not just flip a switch and make an instant industry here. There's still a lot that needs to be done by the legislature to kind of hammer out some of the issues that you all have been raising and talking about, some of the uncertainties in this. So can you just, Jessica, can you give people an overview of just, what still has to happen and how long it might take before this becomes reality if it does pass?
Yeah, sure. So one thing in terms of the enabling legislation that will accompany the legalization of it, right? On a panel last week, Senator Scutari said that they are diligently working on that type of legislation, and that it will be using the framework of the old adult use bill 2703, but that obviously changes needed to be made into it. So that type of legislation will need to come in place. Really, in terms of when we're going to see really this market thrive, I think it is going to take some time. But truthfully, I'm pretty patient with it because I want this to be done correctly. This does not need to be something that is rushed. The one thing that really does need to be rushed is the fact that 96 people are getting arrested every single day. And if we do not legalize this year, we won't be able to for another 3 to 4 years. That's 96 people per day times 3 or 4 years that are continuously going to get arrested. And so that's one aspect that I do think that needs to be expedited. But in terms of preparing, we don't have our commission just yet. That also still needs to be formed. So I don't think until our commission is formed, but we won't really be seeing a legal market expanding just yet. However, once again, I'm patient with it because I do want the legislation to be done correctly.
Mm-hmm. So one thing that's very common in other states is they will take the current operating dispensaries and grandfather them into adult use. So that will give us a bridge between the new facilities opening and serving some demand for the residents of New Jersey. Also, we do have a licensing round that was involved in a lawsuit, and there's a lot of really qualified applicants in that. So we could see those also being grandfathered in or turning into adult use licenses, as well as, there's so many qualified people in that round maybe there's some creative solutions. And really, one thing I missed with the tax revenue earlier is that municipal tax revenue, while not in the ballot question, has been in every piece of legislation and certainly will make it in the new one. And that municipal tax revenue will have to go into the town. It won't be something the governor can dip into. And so you will see visible, tangible improvements in these towns that host these adult use dispensaries.
And Bishop James, do you have, pending this passes or doesn't, what is next on for the opposition to this? Is it to try to influence any legislation in some way to just keep fighting against an adult use program? What is
absolutely to influence legislation? They talked about getting it right, and we've been at the table since the beginning. As a matter of fact, I was one of Phil Murphy's first minority advisors before he was governor. And I said to him, Governor, well, he wasn't governor at the time, but I said to him, Phil, the problem when you're talking about legalizing marijuana, you're going to open up a can of worms that's going to finish devastating the African-American market. You're going to open up a can of worms that folks are going to lose housing. And let me say this, it's not just public housing. My daughter lives in a complex. It's a no smoking complex. We've seen children, and no one is talking about this. They can pass it if they want, but when, it falls, it's almost like saying, we know what's good for you. The reality is it's going to devastate some people. And as I agree with both Tara and Jessica on this, right now, the big guys run everything around the nation, and they're going to continue to do it because they can buy it up. This is a Wall Street project. This is not a Main Street project. That's real.
I just want to let anyone who's watching know that they can drop any questions they have that we, might not get to as we're about to wrap up into the comments. And we're going to be working on a post kind of answering some of those still lingering questions that we couldn't address here today. But I just then, want to wrap this up and have everybody give their final thoughts, just as we're now 3 weeks away from Election Day, and many people, have already mailed their ballots, maybe, or are still sitting there with their ballots, having received them in the mail. So, Jessica, do you want to start us off?
Sure. So just my final comments that I really like to tell people is that right now, if you're advocating against legalization, you're advocating for the status quo, you're advocating for the growth of an illicit market, you're advocating for unregulated cannabis, you're advocating for untested cannabis, and you're advocating for a lot less protections, and you're advocating for people to continuously get arrested every single day. And that has generational effects, right? That has an effect in terms of jobs, in terms of health, in terms of education. And so what I want to get across to folks is that there is an issue, and we recognize that there is an issue. We've never said that there is not an issue in cannabis. The only way, though, to rectify this issue is through legalization, through creating a regulated, responsible market that will be able to provide quality medicine, because whether or not you are consuming medically or recreationally, it is still a medicinal plant whose medicinal benefits have been around for over 5,000 years. And so what I would advocate to folks is to really think about how the status quo is much more dangerous right now than the legalization that we are trying to propose. So to please turn your ballot around and vote yes to question number 1.
And Bishop, we'll go to you, and then we'll finish up with Tara.
Once again, we're not talking about medical marijuana. I agree there needs to be some changes in the medical marijuana, the cost and how it's done. But let's talk about just wholesale, and that's what it really is, wholesale commercialization of marijuana. We know that, number one, it does affect the mental health of adults, but it really affects the mental health of children. We know, number two, that women, but especially Blacks and Latinos, there's only 2 in the nation that are in the business. We know that if you live and live in public housing or receive federal assistance, whether it's food stamps or some other, you will lose that for at least 5 months, we know that you're going to lose your employment. If you work for the state of New Jersey, you drive for NJ Transit, you work on the trains, you work for PSE&G, or you work in the public school system and so many others, you're going to lose your employment. And so when we talk about wholesale, that we can keep it out of the hands of children, not happening. Even the commercials, if you look at the packs of the edibles, they are advertised for children, Rice Krispies and others. Those of us that have traveled the nation and seen this, the industry has no responsibility, no social responsibility to our children. And legalization will definitely continue, and the black market will flourish because they're always going to be able to undercut the price. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop. And Sarah.
Okay. Really have to clarify, so we're not doing a disservice to women and to minorities. There are not only 2 minority owners in America. The first dispensary owner in the state of New Jersey was a Latino man. So there are many.
Yeah, he's not black.
No, he's not
How many
black.
blacks own?
I don't have the numbers, but though I mentioned those women
Zero.
because they are historic. They are the youngest and the first. They are 2 proud historic women. That's how I knew immediately who they were. I'm sure there are other black dispensary owners. I would love, if you could find a statistic, I would love to know what it is. And I'm sure whatever it is, it needs to be better. But to say there are only 2 is probably a bit disparaging to the other owners out there. I am glad that you brought up children, though, because that is such a great touch point. When people say that we're marketing to children or this candy to children, first off, I would say that the onus falls on the parents, the same as gun ownership, a liquor cabinet, or don't touch a hot stove. But beyond that, we are taking precautions within this legislation 2007-03 that has been developed and will certainly be continued. There are allowances to not have any cartoons on the packaging, not have animal-shaped gummies, to have opaque packaging so children can't see through it, and to have resealable child-proof packaging. So we are taking all the necessary precautions to keep our children safe. More so, what we do see is that underage use goes down in adult because access goes down when you have to be 21 and show ID. You're not having a drug dealer on the corner who, by the way, will have access to more harmful substances. So access goes down, but also the appeal goes down because when you don't have a child, when your uncle, brother, cousin, when they're all doing cannabis, it's not as appealing to a child. It's not an act of youthful rebellion anymore. So underage use goes down. The only use that goes up is people over the age of 50 who use it for aches and pains without getting the prescription. And opioid use goes down because the people who wouldn't have jumped through hoops to perhaps get off more harmful substances now can go just as easy as going to a liquor store and use cannabis for harm reduction and get off a more harmful addictive substance. So there are a multitude of benefits, and because we're redirecting our police force, property values go up. So, and I could go on, and if you would like to know more, there are so many great benefits to legalizing adult use cannabis. You can learn more about me. I am Tara Masu across all social media. Please reach out, and please, on November 3rd, vote, flip over your ballot, and then vote yes to adult use cannabis.
Okay, thank you all 3 of you for joining us, and thank you to all the viewers who tuned in today. This has been a great discussion, guys. And like everyone just said, it's just 3 weeks until November 3rd, and that question is likely on the back of your ballot. So thank you, everyone.